welcome everybody. Welcome to join us. This is a lovely Sunday afternoon, and we invited Dr. Arredondo and Dr. Alvarez joining us talking about leadership and advocacy as psychologists. So I will start by a very brief introduction about the three of us, so you can relate to some of your questions or thoughts to the mentors' experiences. So my name is Yue. I am a fourth year doctoral candidate in the counseling psychology program in Indiana University, Bloomington. And I'm actually going on an internship this year, so I'm moving next week. So that will be fun.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Where are you going?
I'm going to University of Illinois, Chicago. So I'm moving to Chicago.
Oh, cool. All right. I'm sure you'll get a lot of support there. There's so many universities and a lot of multicultural awareness and activity. I mean, it's, maybe better than some other cities, but yes, I think you're going to be in a great spot.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited as well. I think UIC is state school in Chicago and very diverse student population. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, great. Congratulations.
One more big step. Yes. Yeah, almost there. So I will give the space to both of you to introduce yourself to our audience, so our students can know a little bit about your amazing background and your leadership in our field.
Okay.
Thank
you, Alvin. Thank you, Yue. I'm delighted to join all of you this morning and to be able to share a few thoughts on leadership and advocacy with students or professionals who tune in. I know this is meant for students because this is a mentoring series, and I really congratulate the students who have pulled this together. This is the last year I participated, and I'm delighted to do this again because I do believe in the power of mentorship and how essential it is to our career development process. To say a little bit, I've had a long-term career in the field of counseling psychology. And along that journey, I would say I had an opportunity to assume behavior, I guess that you would say would be leadership and advocacy behavior. I was a school counselor back in the day when I was in graduate school. And that informed me quite a bit about, or I would say it did two things for me in particular. It assured my interest in understanding immigrant identity and family development because I was working with a lot of immigrants and refugees at this high school outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I would say also it showed to me how missing our training was when it came to cultural issues, understanding ethnicity, understanding religion, and socioeconomic differences. So those were some of the, awarenesses I developed. And then the third was about how organizations can really do important work if they come together as a team and coalesce around a particular issue. You could say it's a problem, but an issue that needs attention. In this case, it was the success of these immigrant students. So those were pretty important awakenings for me when I was in my doctoral program at Boston University. And that actually those areas have been thematic for me throughout my career. That is organizational development, my focus on immigrants and ethnic minority concerns, and then intersecting identities, broadly speaking. So those are my multicultural competency work. I've had I have had two major pathways, or maybe three. One is I'm a licensed psychologist, so I had the opportunity to engage in private practice after I took my licensing exam. And I'm still a licensed psychologist in Massachusetts. And to me, I guess I would say to anyone, keep your license going. Never give up on a license you have because you've earned it. And even if you're not practicing, it's still a very important credential to have. The second thing I would say in terms of so I was a clinician, I was an academic professor junior professor and then became a senior professor later in my career. And then probably the third pathway was becoming an academic administrator. And then the fourth, so I have to really look at this carefully, was working as an organizational consultant. Now that's not something that I was formally prepared to do, but because I decided to go on that journey when I was in Boston, I prepared myself with all kinds of reading, contacts, and had a very robust career as an organizational consultant for 13 years full-time in Boston, focused on issues of strategic diversity in the workplace. And there I was again able to apply my interest in multiculturalism and competency development, people development, which of course we learn in counseling psychology programs, and transfer a lot of skills that again I learned in my doctoral program and training, you know, skills in evaluation, other types of skills in facilitation, teamwork, and so forth. So those were kind of the four major pathways I would say I've traversed. Mm-hmm. And currently I have my own consulting company again called the Arredondo Advisory Group. I'm based in Phoenix, but because of technology, you know, you can go anywhere and do your work. Nice. Back in the day in Boston, you know, I had my office and it was important to have a storefront and, you know, I could run around the city or I could travel to New York. But today, you know, you travel anywhere and you engage with people by Zoom or other platforms that are real important. And then in my, I guess I would just say, I probably could talk about leadership roles and advocacy later, but I'll just kind of broadly talk about my career path. So it was really allowing me to step into different pathways that I guess I was passionate about. You know, being a consultant is something I'm passionate about. It's working with other people. It's not clinical work. Mm-hmm. But it's still bringing perspectives around issues that organizations, higher ed, universities or other workplaces want to put their arms around. And for me, there's always a cultural focus I can bring in. That might not be the main focus of their work, but my lens is always a cultural lens. And I think it's fairly straightforward. So it's been a very rich pathway to about 5 different cities over my career. And I think that has been the journey is good. And maybe after I can talk more about some of the leadership and advocacy positions more specifically, but I would say I've done advocacy forever. And thinking about those high school immigrant students, that was advocacy work I was doing to make sure we focused on their success, not Patricia just focusing on their success, but a team of people focusing on their success. So that was probably a very important advocacy opportunity I stepped right into.
Right.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Arredondo. It's really inspiring to hear someone who's had a very enriching and successful career and see how different, how psychologists can take on different roles and branch out different areas with the expertise and the lens of culture that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alvarez?
Yeah, thank you, Yue. And Patricia, that was just beautiful. That kind of triggered all these other ideas in my head of how to approach it. So thank you. Thank you for taking that first step. But you know, Yue, before I start, I kind of want to just take a moment and just to really honor both yourself and the rest of the mentoring team and DESA and DESA's leadership. I mean, you know, you have made this a wonderful opportunity for us to share our stories, but also a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with students and with you. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the chance to just, talk story a little bit. So thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your support.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is the best part of the gig. It's interesting. I think there's some parallels in some of our experiences with Patricia, and one of the parallels is, really reaching into those critical incidents. I think is the phrase that she had used, and when she said that, it really drew my leadership path back to when I was an undergraduate. I was a undergraduate student at Irvine. And, I was, like so many other Asian American students, in particular at Irvine, set to go into medicine. And that was really where I wanted to go. I'd wanted to do that for a long time, until a number of incidents really happened. One was, some of my old roommates had said, hey, why don't you come and take this class? It's kind of a different class. It's called this Asian American psychology class. And I still remember sitting on the couch looking at him like, I don't want to do that. And then they said, well, come. Well, what time is the class? When is it? They said, it's Thursday from 7 to 10. And I said, I don't want to do that. It's, Cosby is on at 8 o'clock. I really like the show. And then so they just kind of, blew me off. And then, the night came on Thursday, and my roommates were like, "Come on, just come with us." In fact, it's so funny. I'm going to see this roommate right now. We've remained in touch for years. We're going to have lunch with him. But he said, "Why don't you just come?" And I said, "Well, okay. It looks like it's going to be a repeat. Anyway, I've seen that episode before. I will go." Now, that's how I got into this field. If it was a new Cosby show, I would not have gone.
Oh.
And
priorities.
Right. So I went to this thing, and and it was and this was the first time a course like this had been offered. I never heard of Asian American studies. I never heard of Asian American anything, ethnic studies, nothing, gender studies, nothing. And I walked into the room and I saw everybody in there look like me. That alone is powerful. And I looked at the syllabus. And around week 6, there was 3 hours from 7 to 10 for Filipino Americans. And I looked at that and I thought, like, what in the hell could they possibly talk about Filipino Americans for 3 hours, right? But I was drawn to it. So like, when I think of Filipinos, I think of, lumpia or rice and dancing and, very kind of surface level cultural markers, but I was just intrigued by it. Right? So that was one, and I ended up taking that class, who was taught by a counseling psychologist, a Japanese American gentleman. First time I'd ever had a class with an Asian American professor. He invited us to continue like a small kind of discussion group afterwards. I said yes to that. He needed help with his, he was working on his dissertation at that time, and he needed help with his dissertation, which was on Asian Americans and suicide. And I said yes to that, but all with an eye towards that's going to help me get into med school, right? So I started going to these things and doing these things. So and I started getting immersed on the curricular side, right? And being in spaces with other colleagues of similar curiosity. And at the same time, too, what happened at Irvine, there was a rash of suicides and attempted suicides. And the one common denominator they had was they were all Asian American and Asian students. And the university at the time was just in a lot of turmoil, like what is going on? Why is this happening to this particular community? And they asked us to, and by that point I had joined a student group, which was really kind of a political organizing group. And we organized one of the first, at that time we called it the Asian Pacific Awareness Conference. And it was a group of students who got together and brought workshops and speakers for other students to raise one another's awareness around Asian American issues, right? And so again, that immersed me not only just in my own personal discovery, but connected me to other people again, who are all kind of the same spirit, of the same advocacy, of the same heart. And that was really exciting. But again, I was just planning to go to medical school then. I thought this would be great for medical school. Until the point where I ended up applying to both medical school and grad school in psychology. I still couldn't decide. And I was fortunate enough to get into both. And I was stuck. I was literally stuck at a fork in a road. By that point in life, I had been introduced to Joe White, who was a mentor to me at that point. And I remember, gosh, it's hard to say this, but, probably some time ago on an April, just like this, when we walked around Irvine Lake and we were just talking and we were sitting there and, I was telling him my struggle with it, and he taught me something that I think is important for my leadership journey, which was, okay, so there's this thing you're good at, this medicine thing. I said, yeah. I said, just so you're good at this science thing. I said, yeah, I guess so. And you're good at the chemistry and the biology. And I said, yeah. And he looked at me and said, but you're fascinated by this psychology stuff. And, and that was like the light bulb that really sparked it for me, right? It's like the difference between doing something good or not and being fascinated by it, right? And I say these three little vignettes to say that I think one of the core pieces about my leadership journey is about that emotional passion, right? It's about something burning, something awake inside, right? It's not about a position. It's about the heart of what that means, what the position means, right? And the other piece to this too, for me, is, when I put together that conference, to bring together and work together with faculty, staff, and students, because we formed coalitions, so students work directly with faculty and staff, to educate one another, to empower one another, to do something we had, common values around. That was beautiful. That was real. That the notion of doing things in a community for a community was very, very moving. So I think those are some of the themes, and we can talk about specific positions, but I feel like those thematic nuclei, so to speak, were really what my whole career has been built on. So Let me stop there, and then we can go have a dialogue.
That's cool.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story. That's very inspiring. I didn't know that before.
Yeah, it was a very confused undergraduate career.
Yeah, I've definitely been there. I think a lot of people have been there, and I think it's inspiring to hear that you have made an important decision that probably have changed your career and your life forever, and that's for passion and for the emotional connection and the relation to your self-identity. And I think that that's the best choice that we can make.
But it all hinged on that Cosby episode being a
that's so funny.
Sadly.
That's serendipity. That is so funny. No,
Yeah.
but I think as these are shared with the students, it is those critical incidents. I'm sure all of the students and other professionals can look back at some of those pivotal moments, and at the time they occur, you don't know they're going to be life-changing, right? You just know you're making some decisions.
Absolutely. Dr. Arredondo, I think you're frozen a little. Oh, now you're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't know at the moment that they're life-changing experiences.
Yeah.
But, and I do want to pick up on the mentorship, if you don't mind, that Alvin has started on. because this is what we're also about here. I think the piece on mentorship is one sometimes I did not recognize. I looked at people who were on my dissertation committee, three of the four, as my advisors, and my main advisor really was a mentor. He was the one who invited me to apply to the program and all that. But I think the model we had was one that allowed me to use these three individuals for what they had to offer, which was all very different. Okay. And one individual who's very interested in identity development. So he helped me with my immigrant identity scale. I had a woman from Argentina who was a fighter for bilingual education in the state of Massachusetts. She'd talk about social justice and looking at the way she was engaged in social justice advocacy for bilingual education for thousands of students in Massachusetts. And then my major advisor, who was more of a developmental psychologist, none of them were truly counseling psychologists. The other guy, the identity guy, was also a developmental guy. My guy was more of a cognitive educational psychologist. That was what he was. But they were all wanting to make sure that my interest in immigrants had a platform and had a way of evolving and contributing to the literature, which of course I would say it certainly empowered me to believe what I thought was important. So I think oftentimes mentorship leads us that way to affirm what we think is important, but you hear it from someone else who also says it's important. So it's always in relationship that I think we become empowered. I can do so much for myself, but I've become empowered in relationship to others. And I just want to talk about a little bit, if you don't mind, advocacy and leadership in professional associations versus positions, because I think this is a space where many of our graduate students will emerge into their professional roles and identities, but getting involved in professional associations now, like you and DISA and others are, is I think I'm sure you know is a really great stepping stone in your career development. And I would say for me, going to my first presentation in Chicago as a graduate student, our advisor took us, and then how that helped me become interested in being at the table around human rights issues, social justice issues, and of course multicultural competency. Then that that got put into practice more quickly through my professional association affiliations. Then I was able to put it into higher ed. But I would say that was a great platform, because there were a lot of places where no one was focusing on multiculturalism. Certainly I was a young professor then in a counseling program in Boston, and I would go to an ACA, American Counseling Association conference, because I joined that first before APA. About the same time, but I'd been a student member of ACA when I was in graduate school. And then to see very little attention to issues of culture and gender.
Right.
And so I'll just mention two things. One is I chaired a human rights committee for a number of years with other people who were interested in human rights. And it really kind of seeded our attention to intersecting identities and social justice issues for marginalized groups. I still have my documents that look very much like stuff we use today. It's about 35 years ago. The other part was gender, and that's always been a priority for me in looking at how women advance, how women get their voice. So I was talk about a critical incident. I was at an ACA conference, and I was at a luncheon for the Association of Counselor Educators and Supervisors, and only men got the awards. And this was the second year in a row that had happened. And I said, something's got to change here. So I went back to the university, called all these women. We didn't have social media at the time, called them, and I said, we've got to organize ourselves. This is ridiculous. You know, we have to support mentorship and advancement of women, not only in the profession, in the association, but in the profession. So we formed a group. At the next conference in Houston, we had our kickoff meeting, and we invited men. We said, you know, we're going to do this, but we want you to know that this is important for the association, not just for women. It's important for the association. So it was, again, I guess you could say it was leadership. It was advocacy. I was very passionate about having women have an active role in the association. And I know that was a marking point for the Association of Counselor Education and Supervision, and for ACA to really have women kind of become elected leaders, visible leaders. And, you know, I became ACA president in 2005, about 20 years later, I guess you could say, but still it was setting the table so that those voices would not go unheard.
Right, right. Wow, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arredondo, for sharing your leadership experience. And I think it's it will be very interesting to hear about both of your perspective, because you've had a long career, and like you both said, when you first starting out, multicultural issues and identity issues are very much lacking in counseling or in psychology or in a lot of the fields. So it seems like you were one of those people who were pioneers or trailblazers who really bring us this new perspective. And I can imagine the passion, but also the barriers on the other hand, it's unimaginable for us, because those are the things that we now take for granted. We integrate multicultural and competence so much in our training. So I was having a question in terms of what kind of leadership style do you infuse in your everyday leadership work, specifically coming from both of you and a lot of our students who don't look like the stereotypical white men leadership style, and how do you go into a space and assume a leadership position as a woman, as a person of color, and facing perhaps some of the stereotypes or biases against you, and how did you develop your own leadership style to make it work for you?
Ellen, why don't you start? You are currently a dean.
And the president of Division 45.
And president of Division 45, yes.
Yes, but I would also have to say that my ability to have positions, the fact that this organization exists, the fact that many of these things exist right now, is really tied to a lot of the work that Patricia has done and her cohort and colleagues. I just want to just slow that down a little bit and just honor you, because you have cut the path for so many of us, and it makes it a lot easier for us to walk it, but I know that you cut the path. So
thank you. Thanks, Alvin. Thank you.
Thank you. Boy, Yue, that was a big question.
Sorry, too much. throw both of you right into it.
No. This is good. What is my leadership style? You know, I struggle with that question, because I don't know that I think of it as a style. I think I can tell you some aspects of what's important to me in leadership and what I value. I think I have a very communal style of leadership. It's really important for me to work with and alongside people. And because I think that leadership just by yourself, you know, and expecting to do much is very hard. And I think it's damn near impossible. So I've always been drawn to very communal spaces of leadership where people come together. And the other piece to that too is the values piece, and I kind of touched on this earlier. Having people who have the same shared values is a joy, is a gift, right? Because ultimately, I think leadership requires trust and collaboration and openness with the people you are walking the path with, right? And that only can be possible if you have a shared value system, I think, right? And so I think when you have a shared value system, a shared worldview, and then you have good people you can trust and work with, then I think that puts you in a place where you can really engage and be of service. I think that's the other aspect of my leadership that comes out. It's I see leadership as an act of service, as an act of advocacy. It's to use your privilege, to use your skills, and we all have them. I mean, we are very blessed to be given the skills as researchers, as clinicians, as teachers, as speakers, as writers, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what's that for? And who is that for, right? And that's, I think, where leadership emerges. It's using that privilege, using those skills on behalf of communities or individuals who may not have that voice, who may not have that privilege, right? And I think when you bring together coalitions of people across race, across gender, across different dimensions of identity, I think that's when it's incredibly powerful. The other thing too is, I think leadership is most exciting when the focus is both on individuals but also on systems. I think we all know from our shared histories that part of the challenge of different forms of discrimination, whether we talk about sexism or racism or xenophobia, is that it's embedded in larger systems, right? It's not just a one-to-one. So I think, for instance, in 45, Division 45, one of the exciting things about it is really trying to look at how we can be more effective as an organization and challenge and create systems that are more healing, right? Like, I think this is a healing space, right? This is a powerful space for us to create on behalf of our larger community, right? Where we could share it with our students and our early career colleagues. So I feel like, one of the exciting and most creative parts of leadership is really thinking about, well, how do you get people with the same values, right, with the same heart, to do something on behalf of a community, and creating different systems, right, different programs that embed something that either challenges the racism, the sexism that's out there, or right, creates healing spaces, affirming spaces, spaces that say we exist, we are valued, right? And when you do that kind of, I think there's a real creativity to that is really motivating and self-generating. That's when it's meaningful, So those are some of the aspects, I think. I don't know if that's so much a style, but those are at least some of the dimensions that I think of when I think about leadership. So.
Yeah, right. Thank you for sharing. Yeah,
Sure.
I think that really stand out in terms of how important it is to surround yourself with a community of people who have the shared values and passion with you. And I think there is, I think in the leadership literature, there is something called servant leadership style. I think it's very close to what you were describing, kind of submitting yourself to a larger cause and finding meaning in the work you do and inspiring others to have the same kind of meaning in the work they do. And that's how you get a whole team of advocates to be motivated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
You're very welcome.
See, I think that is, to build on what Alvin said, this is really part of our preparation, I believe, as counselors, counseling psychologists, is to value the relationship. And I would say as a leader, being highly relational, at the same time individualistic, paying attention to each person in your team or in your organization. And I've had a couple of leadership roles in large units. And what I would say, for example, when I was the dean of the School of Continuing Education at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, I stepped into a place that was in transition. I seem to have always stepped into transitional places, and I guess we all do. Some are more steady than others. But the chancellor of the university said to me, Patricia, I'd like you to take that dean's position. I was associate vice chancellor of academic affairs, so I already had a portfolio, but he wanted me to do this. And I listened, and he said, well, you had your own consulting company, and the School of Continuing Education works a lot with business, and they, are very external facing. You don't say no. And I did that for about 4 years, okay, in addition to my other roles. However, it was an opportunity to do some transformational work with the team that was there, about 90 employees in the school. And it was very external facing. And, for me, when I step into these opportunities, it's to do my own gap analysis of what's in place and what's missing. And again, I'm always using this cultural and social justice lens. And so by the time I left that position, we had 38% of our employees were people of color or from underrepresented groups, which was the highest of any of the 12 schools and colleges at UWM. Second, we had established some international partnerships with universities in Egypt, in South Korea, in Guatemala. Those were all new. So again, looking at how we build out the awareness around culture, we added to our certificate program portfolio with the Multicultural Counseling Certificate Program that was taught by my colleagues in the College of Ed. And then the fourth thing is we started a Women in Leadership Conference. Because again, I thought, my gosh, they don't do anything on women. Again, you've already heard me say how important that is for me. And we started a Women in Leadership Conference. I had an advisory council of people from the different industries, and it's in its 10th year. I've been gone around, 5 or 6 years, but it's in its 10th year. So when you think about some of these opportunities or gaps, I always want to think about how will it sustain after I'm gone. And I think that's what leaders also think about, is the sustainability of your work.
Right.
And that you are leaving it behind with other people who will develop it further. You can't be attached. I think that's one of the things I've learned is, and I don't. I think Alvin said it very well. It's using the privilege of being in that particular role or position for the good of the whole. It's not about my glory. It's about what do I want to make sure is better as a result of my leadership and advocacy. And I'd like to think those are, a few, just in an institutional role where I could point to the things I left behind. In all my positions that I started things that really advanced multiculturalism and women's issues. When I was president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in Chicago, we started a women's peer mentorship group, and it's still going. So, it's making sure you're supporting people in the here and now, and then for their future.
Yeah.
Right.
That's beautiful.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, and I feel like from a student's perspective, I think about being a student leader. That's something that we think less about because we're so early on in our leadership development. We think less about the sustainability and how to cultivate the next generation of people who will do the same thing. And I think that piece is valuable for people who are like me, are just starting to learn how to be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a follow-up question I wanted to ask you all, I feel like we might have students who might have the same question in terms of being a young professional, perhaps a person of color, perhaps a woman of color. I think as a very young leader, I certainly feel discomfort at times because I often talk about, as a Chinese woman, I grew up in China and my culture didn't socialize me to be a leader. I was taught that I'm not a leader. And then I am now having the privilege to be educated and to get a lot of resources and skills that I feel like I want to be an advocate and be a leader. However, I think there is always the battle between how we as women or people of color, how we are socialized in terms of what's our position in a society and how to battle with that. And also finding my own style. I personally, I really struggle with delegating tasks and be really assertive and setting up expectations because I always want to make sure, is everybody happy with that? Is everybody comfortable with that? Which is a less, I guess, traditional sense of leadership style. I was more comfortable taking care of people rather than leading people. So I think there's a lot of just transition personally and professionally in thinking about how to integrate effective leadership into our personal style to be comfortable in the role, but also be effective with the team. Yeah. So I'm curious about what's your insights on that. I'm sure each of us have different journey and different struggles, but I'm interested in hearing what are some of the things that you try to integrate as an effective leader.
Patricia, you want me, which way you want to go?
Why don't you start and then I'll pick up because I wrote down a couple key words. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. You know, that you were the piece about being kind of uncomfortable, depending on context, you know, I think is a real powerful one, right? And so many of us are isolated, right? In our programs, in our departments, in our offices, and a lot of us are like, oh, we're the only this, or the only that, and the only this, and or maybe there's one, but you know, we don't really get along, you know, or something. Right? But that sense of isolation is really debilitating, because part of then what happens is that you don't get really reaffirmed for who you are and who you can be, right? Much less being a leader. So one of the things that I would say is that it's important to find affirmative spaces where people can see you and honor you and uplift you and challenge you, right? And validate who you are, as opposed to needing to become somebody else, you know, whether that is by gender or race or any other dimension. And so for me, you know, I at least one of the more powerful spaces, and I think of this as what was the Asian American Psych Association, right? And that was a space separate from APA, which was big and overwhelming, and just I felt lost in that space. And AAPA was my first professional home, and it was small, it was intimate. You know, I could sit down and look next to me, and there's Stan Sue, and you know, he says hi to me. It's like, oh wow, he actually said hi to me. You know, and you know, and he's having a conversation with me, and I'm like, oh my God, what is he doing? You know, I mean, and I say that because, you know, to be seen by such a foundational person in the field is not something we experience on a daily basis. So I think and finding spaces that really I don't have to justify, explain, or teach others about who I am and who I need to be is for me a very important and critical step. And that's actually where my professional leadership journey really began. Began there. And, I started just running the listserv for AAPA, right? Because I just kind of wanted to do something. I mean, it's like, well, that was a nice conference. Maybe I'll do something. I'll run the listserv, right? And Dick Swin was tired of doing it. And he said, is anybody willing? I said, okay, I'll do it. I can do that. And then, I ended up taking more and more positions because, it really was a home, right? And so, and then I eventually became the president of AAPA, but that was only possible because I was part of a community that saw me as a person, that saw me as who I am, and conveyed to me that was valuable, right? So the possibilities of me as a leader in that space could only exist when other people could see the possibilities in me as a person. So I think that's a real important piece. The other comment that I would say, and this really riffs off of Patricia's word relational. I want to take that piece and run with it a little bit if I could. Because I think we also construct leadership to be, it's a very male construction of leadership, right? That's the guy up front. That's the person at the top of the pyramid. That's the person, he knows everything. He will lead us. He will save us. He's got the ideas. He's got, and I've always bristled against that, right? And as I spoke earlier about the communal part, I won't go into that, but one of the pieces I would say about leadership for me, and it speaks to your notion of struggle, is that openness to struggle, that openness to not knowing, right? Because there's going to be a lot of spaces and a lot of incidents and a lot of issues where you're going to walk into it and you're not going to know what to do. And I think that's okay. I think that, there's no textbook, there's no playbook on these things. And one of the things that I have found, which gets back at the relational aspect, that has really helped me in my leadership steps, is having a colleague, and I'm not talking about a lot, but I'm talking about maybe just one, really. Somebody who I can, at the end of the day, go, after a meeting or after something, I can sit down and say, I got no idea what to do. Somebody where I can be really vulnerable with, somebody that can really honor that struggle and struggle with me, somebody I can really trust to call me on things I'm blind to, things I'm ignoring, or, possibilities I'm not seeing, right? And that kind of in-depth colleague, right? And not just in leadership spaces, but just in professional and friendship spaces, having that kind of person is really just really invaluable. I mean, like right now, my formal job is as a dean. I've got 6,000 students. I've got about 400 faculty, and the scope of who I've got to understand is really beyond what I can fully absorb. I do my best at it, but I don't pretend to know everything. That would just be hubris. So having my associate dean, we have become very, very close. My senior leadership team, we're very, very close. There's a lot of vulnerability. There's a lot of willingness to be like, I got no idea what to do with this. And, if you've got somebody you could say that to and know that you will not be diminished when you say that, and that people, then that is a signal to, okay, let's engage with this. Let's wrestle with this. Let's think this through. Boy, that's a good team. That's a really good team. And I'm very blessed by having people. I've always had at least one or two people like that in my life and career, and that helps. That helps. So I would say that, struggle is part of leadership.
Correct. Gosh, Alvin, you've said so many relevant and made so many relevant comments, and you served it up with a great question. And this is, obviously going to take us a much longer time if we were to really discuss it. But there were a couple key things I want to just take away from both of your commentaries. One is the whole idea of recognizing our socialization as women and men, and the cultural overlays and how that follows us, and what that means in terms of talking about leadership, the kinds of roles we feel we want to step into, or the messages to not step into them. Okay, and then the statement from Gloria Anzaldúa, which is about living on the borderlands, that we're always kind of walking the borderlands as people from underrepresented groups because of our visibility. And that's one of the many reasons we're walking the borderlands, where, you're in a counseling psych program, you are a Chinese heritage student, you're interested in studying all of those things, and you're in Indiana, another space where expectations might be had of you, which are not your expectations that you were socialized in. So socialization, visibility, identity, those are all so much a part of this complexity when you step into leadership. And I think the other part for people then who, whether you're, let me just say as a student, I think it is important for students to feel a sense of relating and identity through one of the ethnic minority psych associations. At the same time, it's important to step into some of the other spaces. Division 17, Psychologists for Social Responsibility, because you have to really broaden your net. I was thinking when Alvin mentioned very quickly Richard Schwinn, when Richard became president of APA, he invited me to be on one of his work groups. And then he invited me because I had shown up at different things. And over, probably about 10, 15 years already. But I think we have to be able to have our visibility be in a number of spaces. And I think what Alvin would say, and I know I have said as the leader in a university position, I am the president for all faculty, staff, and students, not just for the ethnic minority, not just for the women. We represent all of them, or our responsibility is all of the unit. And, people might have expectations because they look at us and they say, oh, she's a Latina, she's Mexican American and all that. But, that's okay. I mean, you have to kind of acknowledge that, but that's not who you are. I mean, not in this position. I mean, you are always that, but you are the president, you're whatever, the dean of all of it for everybody. And that is another tightrope to walk because, again, if we had more time, the expectations people have of us because they don't expect people like us to be in those roles of leadership. So that's where you use your emotional intelligence that we all have as counseling psychologists and look at how we respond and lead and allow ourselves to be vulnerable. So thank you.
Yeah, thank both of you. I think what you said, both of you were so valuable for me personally to hear and for our other students or ECPs to hear. And I think what we have talked about really demystified the idea of leadership in terms of what it means to be a leader. It's not this invincible person on the top who knows everything. It really takes a village. It really takes friends and colleagues and a space to be able to be vulnerable, to be a good leader. I think that's very reassuring and validating. And I think in the socialization piece that brings into leadership is also something that maybe not a lot of us have thought about, but I think it's very true that we have to carry our histories or how the society views us into the leadership space. And I think that's also kind of a process in terms of how to navigate the space, not only represent our own cultural group, but also represent people who are not similar to us.
Yeah. Well said.
Thank both of you.
Yeah. Good summary.
I know. Thank you. I try. I know we're a little tight on time, but I do want to get to a few, maybe two more important questions. So one question is, could both of you tell us, as students, how can we be advocates without jeopardizing our own careers? And in terms of students, I think being in a less powered position, and try to be a leader and kind of navigating that space.
Mm-hmm. Well, you never go it alone.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's a concern in your program, that it's probably not just your concern. I'm sure it's probably a concern for others in the program. So I would say there's less risk if you're a group. Okay, there's less risk if you have a faculty or two who you could have a conversation with about your concerns before you run with it, and put it all over social media or post it on your program Facebook page and on the program listserv. So I would say it's having those small group conversations around a concern so you don't become the identified troublemaker, and then make sure you have some faculty who will hear you and say that they get it and will support whatever you as a student group wants to do. I think that's key to I think it's like everything, it's how you build coalitions. It's in relationship to others. So yeah, nobody wants to damage their reputation in graduate school.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Everything she said. So let's start there. I've put on my headphones because my daughters have now entered the house, and I don't think you need a recording of them right now. But I think the piece that I would add, just real briefly, is really finding folks that you can, again, trust. Right, and that could be mentors who can help guide you, allies who are, have more power, I think is really important. Having a faculty member, administrator who can guide you in terms of navigating that kind of advocacy, I think is really, really important. So that you're not alone as students, that you are working within, and because you are in a very vulnerable position. So I think that leads then to, I think particularly as psychologists, and particularly as people of color and women and queer communities, we are very well attuned to that notion of trust, right? You can figure out who you can trust. You can figure out who is really hearing you, seeing you, valuing you, and who's just paying lip service. I would say trust that, because I think that will help you identify the kinds of allies who can be very real, who can be very genuine, who can walk you through the pros and cons. But by this point in your career, you have had skills to be able to navigate power and hierarchies. And that's still the same skill you're going to need to do exactly what you're talking about. So you're not walking into this new, right? You have skills there. Use those skills to find those allies.
Yeah. Thank you for the reassurance and encouragement for all of our students. And I think that also kind of brings up the theme of really finding who can support you and find a group, find a coalition, and do it together.
Right.
Yeah. I also want to ask the question in terms of, how do you know what you are doing is leadership and or advocacy? And I'm thinking about this question along the lines of, as counseling psychologists or psychologists, we're mainly trained to conduct research and provide clinical services, and that's our expertise. And leadership development is not always in the curriculum. Maybe not explicitly. Maybe I know some programs are more integrated with leadership development. Some programs are not. So sometimes students might struggle with how do I be a leader as a psychologist, and what counts as leadership? So I'm curious to see what you think.
Oh, I love that question. That's great. That's great.
That's actually not my question. Dr. Arredondo sent me the question earlier. I thought that was
okay,
excellent.
Alvin, go for it.
Oh,
yeah.
This is rigged. Oh, no.
But I'm fixing it by being transparent. Hopefully
Okay. Wow, I love that question. How do we know? You know, I would have to say one of the things that really triggers for me is I think, and maybe this really is reflecting the relational style that we've been referencing all. I feel like as our training as psychologists is beautifully positioned for leadership, right? I mean, you know, I joke with my provost, who's the head of, you know, for the entire university. I said, you know what, you should just fire me and then rehire me at my clinical rate, because virtually everything I do is either individual, couples, group, or crisis counseling. And guess what, right? I mean, like, I would be able to put about 80–90% of what I do in one of those buckets, right? And I said, because and you know, I was just talking to a dear friend and colleague who's actually one of my chairs now, Rebecca Toporek, and we were wrestling over a situation, you know, just on Friday. And I said to Rebecca, I said, you know, I'm at a loss for how people do this kind of work without clinical training, because it is so people-oriented, right? It is finding a way to hear somebody. That's clinical work. Finding a way to confront and challenge somebody. That's clinical work. Finding a way to, you know, calm, stabilize somebody who is in distress. That's clinical. Finding a way to get two groups to kind of negotiate and treat each other with respect. That's facilitation skills. Sitting in a room with 15 people for a meeting and making sure that you're attending to the pockets who are speaking and those that are not, and then creating a space that allows people to speak. That's group skills, right? So I just, you know, Rebecca and I were just chuckling because it's just like, you know, no offense to like an economist or a physicist, but I sit there and feel like, how would they do this? Because this is really hard without my clinical training, right?
Right.
And how to treat people with dignity, to hear their story, to hear their pain, you know, and yet still move them forward. I mean, it's all, I could frame this a lot in a clinical world.
That's right.
So I find that my training on the clinical side has been enormously helpful. In academic administration, the other skill set that I find enormously helpful has been my quantitative training, right, as a scholar. Because there's just a lot of quantitative analysis, budgets, spreadsheets, and, you know, while I'm not trained as an accountant, I feel comfortable with numbers. I feel comfortable looking at, you know, a trend line, and I know the difference between, well, that's, you know, that's just a one-year number. I'd like to look at the median and a rolling average. I mean, it's very part of an extrapolation of our training. So I actually feel like being a psychologist and our clinical training really positions us well, because ultimately we're not just leading objects, right? We're not leading an organization. We're not leading, you know, something inanimate. We're leading and walking with people, right? and being able to understand their life story and what that means and what those needs mean and how that, you know, the responsibility that comes to us, you know, hearing that is very much a psychological piece. So it helps in a tremendous amount.
That was beautiful, Alvin. I really think that should be bottled.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
Really, you know, I have nothing else to add, only because I have to also get off. I mean, I have to move on to an appointment. I think he summed it up so beautifully. And when I said earlier, looking at the transferability of skills, I think you captured it so succinctly with looking at the clinical skills, the evaluation and statistical skills, and how you think about, and you know, how you analyze situations. All of those are skills or competencies we've been taught in graduate school. And then of course you, with the people part of it, understanding the, you know, the multicultural dimensions and the all of the complexity of people in order to know what kinds of approaches you take to move through situations. So I think it's really an outstanding commentary around how you bring that from graduate school to the postgraduate school life.
Yeah. Thank you both. And I think that was really eye-opening to see how our training has already prepared us with many skills that other professionals may not have. And we're just needing to realize how this can be very versatile and transferable to other areas and to leadership and advocacy.
Just don't show this tape to economists or physicists that I reference. Just, you know, hide it from them.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for spending the time with me and with our students. I know we're a little out of time, and Dr. Arredondo, you have another appointment, so I really want to honor your time and both of your time. I just want to thank you again for being here. I know our time is short, and I really appreciate how generous you both are with sharing your personal experience and going a little deeper into some of the struggles that we may have as students or as minority students in the leadership and advocacy phase. And I think our students will benefit tremendously from this. And we will also invite students who watch and listen to this webinar to reach out to our mentorship committee if you would like to receive more in-depth individual mentorship from either Dr. Arredondo and Dr. Alvarez. We're here to coordinate and support you through that process as well.
Wonderful.
I want to thank you both again.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a lovely facilitation, Yue.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both. I learned a lot.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Folks. Have a lovely Sunday.
Bye.
You too.
Wonderful day. Yep.
Bye.